So us security people like to say, don't store what you don't have to, and store it for as little time as possible when you do have to. And a judge just came in and said that OpenAI can't do that. They can't delete the logs of the data that they output. So even if you turn on a little temporary chat or you delete your chat in ChatGPT, they have to retain a record of it. This is because of a lawsuit stemming from the New York Times pushing back against ChatGPT basically eating their lunch. They're saying that ChatGPT is trained on copyrighted material and basically that users don't go read the New York Times anymore because they can just get that information from ChatGPT. OpenAI is coming back saying, hey, we are just following our data retention policies, the regulations that we need to abide by, things like GDPR. If a user asks us to delete this data or to never store it in their settings, we need to comply with that due to many, many different privacy laws and regulations, but they just got a court order saying that they can't do that. I want to pull up the court order. I want to pull up the lawsuit that started it all. I want to pull up OpenAI's current response that they just put out yesterday. And I want to talk about some of the ripple effects here. I'm already seeing people on social media saying they are moving all of their professional, personal, Gen AI usage away from OpenAI because they're concerned with now OpenAI is storing everything that you send it. More specifically, it's storing every response it ever gives to you. So if you give it sensitive information or if it generates source code that you wind up using, by this court order, they have to save that. So that would be vulnerable to a lot of different things, especially if OpenAI deals with some sort of data breach. Now, a lot more sensitive information is being stored and ready to be there for the taking. So I'm seeing people get a little squeamish about all the information that needs to be stored there now. Granted, if your threat model is already like top tier, you probably already weren't sending data to OpenAI that you would be worried about. But for a lot of us, we use a lot of these popular LLM tools, and our threat model allows us to give it even sensitive information like finances or source code or PII, especially with the settings turned on to delete your data. So I want to get to the full court case, but first I want to talk about the sponsor of today's video, which actually develops a solution to protect against this whole thing, which allows you to use these AI tools safely, even with this new court order that OpenAI has to comply with. And that sponsor, of course, is Harmonic. Their tool is built to allow the developers or the employees of your company to use these AI tools safely and allowing you to set policies of what sorts of company or sensitive data goes out to these tools. So I asked them if I could see behind the curtain of the product, and they sent me this demo. I'm going to click play and I'm going to get my face out of the way. This is a look at their platform. They're going to create a rule detecting this kind of sensitive data going to OpenAI. So they create a scenario, they label it OpenAI, they say it applies to all employees, then they actually pick the ChatGPT applications that they would like this to apply to. So this rule is going to detect when a user in their browser is using one of these applications. And then if you see in this dropdown, they are creating detection types. So this is the type of sensitive data that you would like to make sure does not go to ChatGPT. So, okay, mergers and acquisitions, proprietary source code. And then do we want to warn the user, give them a little nudge, say, hey, you might not want to do that? Or do we want to outright block the user from doing that completely? This is what one of their warnings looks like. So it'll pop up and say, hey, sensitive data warning. I think you might be sending some source code to ChatGPT. Are you sure you want to do that? Then they actually pull up ChatGPT. You could see them say, hey, help me check this for spelling. And they paste in a whole like contract that they're not supposed to paste in. And that's when they get their sensitive data warning that says, hey, you're sure you want to do that? Please read the company AI policy. And this is baked into your user's browser. So this does a few things. This allows your employees to actually make use of these groundbreaking tools that could make them more productive and they want to use. And by the way, spoiler alert, if your employees want to use something, they're gonna use it whether or not you block it. So if you give them this nice, friendly guardrail of a nudge, say, hey, please edit your input, or even allow them to use the tool but block on the sensitive data, it's a guardrail that's letting them use the tools safely. You become your team's best friend by not being the department of no. Nobody likes a security team that's the department of no. Thanks so much to Harmonic for being a continued supporter of this channel. I really appreciate it. I'll include a link to them in my bio. Please check them out. All right, so let's get back to the story at hand. First and foremost, this is the lawsuit that started it all. The New York Times takes OpenAI to court. ChatGPT's future could be on the line. The other thing I want you all to keep in mind here is that this is really only going on against OpenAI and Microsoft, the major OpenAI investor. And as it states here, you could see a lot of other media companies are cutting deals with OpenAI, content sharing deals, basically licensing, saying, yeah, go ahead, OpenAI, you're probably going to scrape us anyway. We might as well get some cash from it and just give you permission to do it. But New York Times isn't having it. If you're a listener of the Scott Galloway podcast at all, he used to be on the board of the New York Times back when search engines like Google were exploding, and there was a very similar thing going on then. Google was scraping content like the New York Times to then serve up in its search results pages. And more as the future went, Google was sending less traffic to the sites that it was scraping and putting more of what the users were searching for in that search results page on a Google property. So when you listen to Scott tell the story, he said, hey, they missed the boat on the search engines. They lost that battle. Google won that battle. So it seems like they're trying to not lose this battle. So they're saying the publisher's core argument is the data that powers ChatGPT is including millions of copyrighted works from news organizations. They're saying articles that the publications argue were used without consent or payment. So they're saying that this is massive copyright infringement. They're saying you have to follow the data like you have to follow the money in criminal court. They're saying the data leads to ChatGPT and Microsoft profiting from the journalistic work since it was scanned and processed when OpenAI was training its models. This is an important line here I want to focus on. They say there's an unlawful use of the Times work to create AI products that compete with and threaten the Times' ability to provide that service. This is an important caveat I was learning in researching this. When it comes to free use of copyrighted works, you have to change the work in a material way, and you have to try to not compete with the service or in the industry of the copyrighted works. So they're saying not only did they train their model on all this copyrighted data, they are trying to compete with us. People are not using the Times as much because they can get that information from ChatGPT. OpenAI is arguing fair use, saying that the text is transformed significantly. They've had to explain how large language models work in court, saying that these articles are sorted into a series of tokens. Like, no, the words on the article barely matter anymore. Large language models are just turning this into vectors and tokens and all this kind of stuff, and the actual spirit of the article is lost. The model is just recognizing patterns that it saw in the language. Their lawyer is saying basically it's not like someone can go to ChatGPT and say, hey, can you give me that New York Times article that's behind that paywall today and just regurgitate the entire article to me? They're saying it's not what it's designed to do, and it's not what it does when it comes to how ChatGPT operates. This isn't a document retrieval system. Microsoft is piling on, saying that basically the Times is using its megaphone and this whole lawsuit to come after a threatening technology. Again, this just sounds like the Google story all over again. All right, so this lawsuit and that article comes back from January, a few months ago. And I've read little hummings and buzzings about it since then, but nothing really until just a few days ago when we see this court order come out, and it's kind of scathing. You could tell that this judge is not on OpenAI's side. Also, for all of you technologists watching my channel, which is probably most of you, it's always really frustrating to watch like legal proceedings, whether it's going on in government, like in congressional hearings, or in court, when you can tell that the people making these like decrees or orders fundamentally do not understand the technology that they are making orders about. I understand the spirit of what's going on here. They would like to make sure that any evidence is preserved for discovery for these copyright lawsuits. So if OpenAI is just deleting all of its output to adhere to its privacy policies and GDPR and regulations and users' settings and wishes, that could be destroying things that could be used in future discovery. So this judge starts to talk about, is there a way to segregate the data for users that have expressly asked for their chat logs to be deleted, or is the way to anonymize in such a way that their privacy concerns are addressed. They're saying OpenAI has expressed a reluctance for a carte blanche preserve everything request and raised not only user preferences and requests, but also numerous privacy laws and regulations throughout the country and world that it has to adhere to. So here's kind of the spicy page. The court has reviewed the plaintiff's renewal of their request of an order directing OpenAI to preserve all output log data on a going forward basis. And they've reviewed OpenAI's latest responses. And they're saying that OpenAI's their latest responses do not represent whether they have taken or would take steps to preserve and segregate the output log data that has been marked or requested for deletion, absent of a court order. Then they go on to say, moreover, OpenAI wanted to focus on the many, many billions of conversations that were retained. The latest letter suggests that there's also a volume of deleted conversations that is significant. Deleted underline, basically saying the judge is concerned about this. So accordingly, OpenAI is now directed, all caps, bold, to preserve, underline, bold, and segregate all output log data that would otherwise be deleted on a going forward basis until further order by the court. In essence, the output log data that OpenAI has been destroying, whether such data might be deleted at a user's request or because of numerous privacy laws and regulations that might require OpenAI to do so ordered. So I understand the concern about OpenAI training their models on copyright material without fairly compensating the people that they got that data from. But I also understand what a challenge it might be to have multiple data handling processes going on based on different court orders or different jurisdictions, especially at OpenAI's scale. This is a gargantuan engineering effort that this paragraph just basically tells them that they have to do. And they say that in their response letter. They wrote a response letter just a few days ago. They're basically saying, hey, we write to respectfully request that the court reconsider this massive order that they just put upon us. The order requires OpenAI to disregard legal, contractual, regulatory, and ethical commitments to hundreds of millions of people, businesses, and educational institutions and governments around the world, even though there's no reason to believe that these drastic measures will advance this litigation. Basically saying there is no data in these output logs that we are deleting that would help in this case in any way, even against us. To be clear, OpenAI is taking steps that it can to comply with the order, despite its many practical and engineering challenges that compliance entails. But we urge the court to reconsider the order, both to correct a manifest injustice and because the order is based on material misrepresentation. All right, so they're saying, hey, they don't think that this data would help anyway, so please just let us delete it and not make some crazy engineering effort to bifurcate what we delete, what we don't delete. There is no basis to conclude that the conversation data subject to the order is relevant, especially as opposed to the cumulative billions of conversations that OpenAI has retained. They're basically saying, hey, we don't delete everything, and we think that all the stuff that we don't delete should be plenty for this lawsuit to even go against us if you so choose. Again, knowing how the engineering of all of this works, I tend to believe that statement. Again, not saying I agree with the whole not paying the copyrighted people their fair share. I do have to believe that if they have billions of conversations stored, that you should be able to prove your point in that pile of data. Apparently, they're also suggesting that OpenAI is specifically deleting incriminating evidence. If that's true, that would be wild. Saying OpenAI has not deleted user conversation data for any reason other than to comply with its long-standing data practices. And again, on the engineering effort, OpenAI is taking the steps it can to comply with the order. To be clear, compliance is not a switch flip. OpenAI's data infrastructure is complex, and retaining data that is otherwise slated for deletion requires significant engineering work, significant infrastructure changes, and significant compute resources. I can attest to all of that, having worked at places a fraction of the scale that they're dealing with. They go on to say that even though everything that we said, that we shouldn't have to do this and that this is really, really hard, we are starting to try to do it, but please freaking reconsider. So like I said, I've been seeing some ripple effects go around here. This was just from a newsletter called Good Junior Consulting that I found, but I saw a lot of chatter across different social networks about the same, but this articulated it in a good way, and it seems like they have a good grasp on the legal side of things. They're saying lawyers using OpenAI products such as ChatGPT in their practices may wish to review the court order to decide whether they should modify their organization's AI usage policies. It's basically saying, hey, if you work in the legal field and you're submitting contracts with sensitive legal information to OpenAI, you might want to look at this court order and reconsider the fact that you're doing that. Oh, and by the way, a whole bunch of third parties that you use are also using OpenAI, whether you know it or not, underneath their hood. So you might want to reach out to all of these third and then, God forbid, fourth parties to try to figure out where your data is going and if it's touching OpenAI. This is a nightmare if you thought that you were already good based on your contract, based on your settings, that you thought that that data would be deleted. And now this judge has come out and said that even if you requested it to be deleted, it can't be. So what's the security and privacy takeaway from all of this? First of all, I wanted to get the word out. If you're using OpenAI and you thought you had a grasp on their data retention policies, a wrench just got thrown in that, and you need to figure out what your game plan is. I'd say you have some other options, right? You can switch your usage to different AI models. You could check out the sponsor of today's video, Harmonic, to figure out what sensitive data is going to these models regardless of their data retention policies. Sponsor or not, I think that's a good idea. This is a good suggestion. I like not being the department of no. 3, I think there's another thing we can learn here that has nothing to do with your usage of AI tools and has everything to do with you needing to come up with a playbook to expect that your logs could be subpoenaed in court and a court could mandate you do all sorts of data retention things that you are not doing today. So especially if you work in a heavily regulated industry. I've worked for some of the biggest banks in the world. I've also worked for places that had to deal with lots of GDPR noise. You need a plan. You need a playbook for the day that a lawyer or a judge tells you that you have to throw your data retention policy in the trash for whatever reason they dream up. Another less obvious lesson learned that I got from this is that what if this wasn't such a public lawsuit that was causing this data retention change? Do you monitor the data retention changes to all of your vendors? Some of you might answer that and say, well, yeah, of course we do. But I would double check on that. I'm sure that if something got approved, even with thorough review at the time that a contract was signed, and then some privacy policy or data retention policy got changed at some point during that contract, that someone might not have caught that. All right, I think this case actually hits court next week, so I will update you all on the outcome of all of this. But in the meantime, I think we all have some homework to do. If this was useful, please do all of the YouTube button things below. It helps me more than you know. And subscribe and follow for more cybersecurity news.